Welcome back. In our last few lectures, we discussed how understanding the elements of classical rhetoric can help make you a better reader and writer. By this point in the course, you've also come to understand different genres or categories of writing. You've learned how to unpack or engage poems, short stories, drama, essays, and autobiography. And you've explored the issues of voice or tone. And you've learned how important it is to understand and respect your audience. In this lecture and the next one, we're going to move our attention to some more practical concerns of writing, specifically the process of conducting research and then putting that research to use in a piece of writing. So put simply, today we're going to talk about how to find stuff, and in the next lecture, we're going to focus on what to do with all that stuff once you found it. Now, there are several writing situations in which you might find yourself needing to do some research, and these can range from the most obvious and classic example, like the college research paper, to a magazine article, or a short story, or a letter to the editor of a paper. In other words, almost any type of writing can be improved with a little research. Although the specific example I'm going to use today comes from the academic world, the steps I'm going to outline apply just as easily to an article for a magazine that you're researching, or a report for work, or even a story or novel that's set in a time and place about which you maybe need to learn a little more. The key things for all of these types of writing are knowing your objective, knowing where to look, narrowing your focus, finding a hook, and then figuring out how much time you have for research and when you need to start writing. And you need a plan to get you through all of these steps. So as I just indicated, there are several steps that can help with the process of research. And before you begin, it is most helpful to try and identify what your objective is. Is it to prove a particular position or support a belief that you hold? Is it to educate your audience on a certain topic? Is it to entertain? I find that it also helps to write out what I think my objective is. And I have to keep in mind that as I research and find more information, my objective might change a little bit. Although the objective may change somewhat as you research, having some goal in mind can help you avoid wasting valuable time as you're doing this work. I'm sure you can imagine how discouraging it is to spend several hours researching a subject related to your main topic, only to discover that when it comes time to write the thing up, you really don't need that extra research in order to make your point. And then you think, but I did all this work. Let me show you what I did. And the end result could be that you end up muddying your main point rather than clarifying it. After identifying your objective, however nebulous it might be at this point, your next and perhaps most important action will be to find your hook, or the way into your research. For example, let's say you want to write a murder mystery. If that's all you know, and that's totally fine at the earliest stages, then starting research can seem like a really daunting task, as you could just start looking things up and reading about them and never stop. But maybe you could find a way to narrow your research and give yourself a clearly defined way in. For example, you might start small and decide, I'm going to go to the library or my local newspaper's archives, and I'm going to look up the articles about every murder that's occurred in my area in, say, the last 20 years. Or you could decide, I want to write a mystery like Agatha Christie or Ellis Peters, in which case you might start by reading the works of those writers very carefully in order to get some inspiration. Now, maybe after starting with this as your way in, you decide you want to narrow your focus to, let's say, poison. So then you start reading about different poisons, eventually narrowing your specific focus to, let's say, arsenic or something similar. But obviously, in a case like this, you do need to be a little careful. The writer Umberto Eco, whose medieval murder mystery The Name of the Rose has become really a classic, tells a story about how he had decided that in The Name of the Rose, the poison in the book would be applied to the corners of the pages of a book that was read by medieval monks. And the monks in the story would be poisoned through the act of licking their fingers before they touched the corner of each page to turn it. Without thinking this through too much, he wrote to an acquaintance who specialized in plants, and he asked that friend if he knew of some substance that could poison someone if it was administered in this way. But Eco neglected to say that he wanted to know this as part of research for a novel he was writing. Understandably, this acquaintance replied with something like, yeah, I don't think I'm going to be able to help you with this. Now, sometimes in a case like this, you have to do research in order to know what it is that you want to research. This sounds a little silly, but at the early stage of researching, before you have a topic really narrowed and limited to something that's workable for the length of your assignment, it's ideal to read as much as you can on anything related to your general topic. Or, as I tell my students, you might reread a particular text or poem you enjoyed and try to figure out why you enjoyed it. Or was there something in the text that you found puzzling, that grabbed your attention? That might be the way to focus your energies in terms of research and provide you with a place to start. Here's an example of finding a hook from my own graduate school days. I was trying to write a research paper on Sir Thomas Malory's version of the Arthurian legend, and I was totally lost. I decided to focus on the quest for the Holy Grail, so I read that section of the book over and over. And then I went and I read Malory's source for that story. And something caught my attention. At a key moment in the story, King Arthur orders his nephew Gawain to do something. Gawain obeys the order, he fails at the task, and then he's told that he shouldn't even have tried. I know that, he says in response, but I could not disobey my lord. And in this case, when he says lord, he means his uncle, the king. That's what he says in the French. But in Malory's version, one word has been altered. I could not disobey my uncle, Gawain says. He doesn't say lord, he says uncle. I was intrigued by the shift in emphasis. Why did Malory want to call attention to the family relationship rather than the ruler-subject one? With this as my hook, as a way to focus my research, I discovered all sorts of changes in Malory's version of the Grail Quest, and a lot of these changes related to the matter of families. With this as a focus, researching got a whole lot easier. Or here's a semi-fictional example from that recent bestseller, The Girl Who Kicked the Hornet's Nest, by the late Stieg Larsson. Now, at one point in this thriller, a minor character who's a magazine reporter wants to do an article on why rents and appliances cost so much in Sweden. Where to start? Well, he notices that two companies that sell toilets sell almost the identical toilet for dramatically different prices. Okay, he thinks. Here's a hook. Let's start with toilets. I mean, everybody needs toilets after all, right? So, good place to start. He researches where and how they're made, all the way in Indonesia, he discovers, and then he investigates the conditions in which the workers produce them. This leads him to discover some appalling facts about labor laws, or actually specifically the lack of labor laws. And he discovers some other things about human trafficking and kickbacks. And finally, discovers that a powerful man on the board of directors of his own magazine is in fact an evil opportunist. And all of this starts from toilets. This is a classic example of how your research project can change once you get started. And here you have to be careful. But come on, if you're trying to write a compelling investigative piece, human trafficking is going to get your work more attention and potentially more Pulitzer Prizes than an article on the inflated prices of toilets. Although, since, as I noted before, everyone needs toilets, that piece too would probably find an interested audience, to be sure. Now, in addition to finding a hook or a way into your research project, it is imperative, and I cannot stress this enough, it is imperative that you have some sort of schedule. This can be really general, something as simple as, this week I'm just reading and taking notes. Next week, I'll start writing. Or it could get really specific, something like Monday, 2 hours reading, a half hour drafting ideas or points for an article or essay. Tuesday, 4 hours reading, or if you've identified some key articles or books that you think will be central to your research, you can identify by which day you hope to have read through each of these. Now, if you're working on something like an article or short story that you're composing for your own pleasure or satisfaction, you may be thinking, well, I don't need a schedule. I don't really have an external deadline. It'll be done when I finish it. That's okay, but I promise you, you will be more productive and focused if you try to give yourself a schedule and some deadlines. You may not meet those deadlines, and the planned schedule may go totally wonky at some point because of, life getting in the way. But at least having a schedule will help you focus and move forward. So let's look at a rather classic example of the kind of writing that demands research and explore the process by which you might try to complete it. Whenever I teach a course called the Arthurian Tradition, and this is a class that focuses on literature that tells the story of King Arthur, it covers works written in the Middle Ages up to the present day. I always finish the course with a research assignment, and it's usually something like, use at least 7 secondary sources and then make an argumentative claim that you support with both direct textual evidence from a primary source and that you also support with secondary evidence you've discovered in your research. Okay, so given an assignment like that, where would you begin? The assignment, as I've given it, is deliberately broadly described, and it's really nonspecific, because when I teach this class, I really want to hear what my students have found most interesting in the course. And I want to give them the freedom to explore a theme or an idea that most appeals to them. As you could probably guess, though, some students are totally at a loss when it comes to finding the hook or the way in to start their research. So what happens next is I usually have a conversation with the student and I try to find out what he or she found most interesting or intriguing or puzzling in the class. Sometimes it's a single text that we read in this Arthurian literature course, and it's this single text that stayed with them. And the student might say something like, I'm interested in how important the role of magic is in Arthurian literature. The student could then start researching King Arthur and magic as a means to narrowing the topic still further. In other words, what he finds in this initial research period might then help him to zero in on something particular about magic and King Arthur. Who wields magic? For what ends? In what texts is magic most important? These could all be questions that the student asks and looks into as he's doing his research. That's all well and good, but how do you actually begin to do that? Well, you might start with an internet search. It's quick, it's easy, you don't even have to get out of your chair to do it, and in some cases, literally millions of pages of information will be at your fingertips almost immediately. So you might ask, what's the problem here? Well, the problem is also one of the most exciting things about the internet, and that is that literally millions of pages of information will be at your fingertips almost immediately. How do you sort through this information? And better yet, how do you decide which information is useful and which is not? Which information comes from a responsible scholar who's done some thorough research, and which comes from someone who has a crazy theory and it's all built out of wild conjecture? That's the tough part, and I'm going to try and give you some tips to make this a little easier. There's absolutely a time and a place for internet research, and I will admit right up front that I use the internet all the time for all kinds of research. At the same time, however, relying on the internet as your sole source of information can be dangerous. Remember, anyone can post anything they want on the internet, and there's really no way to fact check what you find unless you, guess what, do a whole lot more research, and not just on the internet. For example, last week I did a Google search for King Arthur. The first page to come up is one for a company called King Arthur Flour. They make very fine flour for all your baking needs, including Queen Guinevere cake flour, Sir Lancelot high gluten flour, etc., etc. But that's not going to help anyone trying to do a research paper on King Arthur. The next page that comes up after King Arthur Flour is the Wikipedia page for King Arthur. Now, 9 times out of 10, I have found that the information on Wikipedia is more or less reliable, But this is also a source that can be altered by anyone. It's not rigorously fact-checked in terms of the way that the academic world would think rigorous fact-checking should be done. And Wikipedia entries can be slanted depending on the interests of the person writing the entry. You might look here, certainly, for an overview of information, but I'll tell you right now, if you are writing a college-level paper or an article for a magazine, citing Wikipedia as a source will not earn you any points with your professors or your editors. Okay, so after the Wikipedia site, there's a website dedicated to the movie King Arthur, which starred Clive Owen, along with some images of him as King Arthur. And these are lovely to look at, but they're not going to help you with your research paper. Next comes the Britannia source for info on King Arthur. As an academic source, this is pretty reliable, but it doesn't do much to give you a handle on whatever specific topic you want to research, except it can serve as a really basic starting point. Obviously, your research is going to turn up a few other sites. One of these is the website of Arthuriana, the premier scholarly journal on all things Arthurian. And full disclosure here, I have recently become the editor-in-chief of this journal, and I think it's very, very important and does very good work of providing the world with the latest solid research on all things Arthurian. The website of Arthuriana has links to pages with resources on teaching. It's got a list of key texts for anyone interested in the Arthurian tradition. And you can also subscribe to the electronic version of the journal. And that gives you access to the latest scholarly research on the legend of King Arthur. Now, obviously, as an academic website, this is a reliable source both for basic information and to guide you to other reliable sources of more specific information. But in my Google search, this site was immediately followed by the website of a guy who thinks he's the reincarnation of Arthur. And then that was followed by a site that publishes Arthurian fan fiction. Fan fiction is when people rewrite stories or imagine new episodes of a well-known, long-established story. If you're trying to write a scholarly essay on Arthur, obviously those sites aren't going to help you any. So, what are some clues that sources online might be reliable and might point you in the right direction? Well, one clue would be if a site has an edu ending. This would tend to mean that the website and its author are affiliated with the university, where people, make a living studying these kinds of things. But you do have to be careful that you're dealing with an official site edited by a scholar and not a student at the same university simply posting his or her thoughts on the topic. The same criteria apply for print sources that have an online component. If you want to research microbes in space, you can bet that you'll find the most reliable information in a scientific journal like Nature. Fairly reliable information, although perhaps not as scientifically detailed, you might find on the website for the New York Times. And if you find an article on microbes in space in the National Enquirer, well, obviously, you're probably going to want to stay far, far away from that. You also absolutely want to stay away from those sites that claim to be able to sell you research papers on a variety of topics. These are simply thinly disguised tools, or I would say in many cases are not even disguised at all, for helping people plagiarize. The quality of the papers on these sites is not very good. It's a total waste of time and money. Now, other reliable sources of information would be long-established scholarly entities like the Encyclopedia Britannica or the Oxford English Dictionary. Things like that. Okay, so let's go back to our hypothetical example of the research paper on Arthurian literature. So the web, obviously, is just a starting point. For this kind of writing, I can't stress enough how important it is to actually get into the library. Many electronic resources that would be helpful with a project like this can only be accessed from libraries. There are a lot of different databases out there that can help you with this kind of writing, and there are many databases geared toward particular fields. For example, for a paper like this, I'd tell my students to do a search for their topic in the MLA or Modern Language Association database, or else the Arts and Humanities Citation Index, Or there are some full-text databases like Project Muse and JSTOR. Nearly every field of interest has specialized databases for reliable information in that field. In my field, literature, the MLA database is the gold standard, and there are several other good ones as well. You should find out what the most useful databases are for your field of interest, and if you're not sure, ask a librarian. Databases come and go, they change, they get updated, but these are not entities with minds or self-awareness. Librarians make it their business to keep up with the changes, to be able to listen to what you're working on and help you find the sources that will best help you at that moment. In this age of amazing computer technology, the human factor often gets overlooked. But remember, librarians have experience. They know the idiosyncrasies of this or that database, and they're there to help you. So please ask them for help, as they can certainly, at the very least, guide you to the database that's going to be of most help to you, and they're going to help you get there much more quickly than you could find it on your own. Okay, so once you've got a range of books and articles, you're going to want to get your hands on as many of them as possible. Sometimes this is really easy. You check to see if your local library has one of the books on your list, the library's catalog says it does, and off you go to pull it off the shelf. Now here's something to remember as you're wandering the stacks of your library looking for a particular call number. Once you find the book you're looking for, don't just take it off the shelf and walk away. You really should take a moment to stop and look at what books are around the one that you just grabbed. Very often what you'll find is that there are other books in this same area which are related to your topic. And some of them may, in fact, have not come up in your initial database search for a variety of reasons. I learned this lesson when I was in graduate school and I was working on my dissertation. Once, while I was in the library to get a book, I noticed that there was this series of monographs on the shelf that were directly related to my main topic. They were just one shelf above the book that I was actually looking for. So while I was there, I grabbed those books as well as the one I had originally come in search of. I checked them out, and I found these unexpected monographs to be really helpful. A few months later, sometime after I'd returned them, I realized that I wanted to look at one of them again. I knew what the title was, so I went back to my library and I did a search in the catalog to find the location of the book so I could check it out again. When I searched for the title, it didn't come up. So I tried the next approach. I searched for the editor's name, and luckily I remembered this name as well. No luck. I then tried a keyword search. No dice. And finally what saved me is that I remembered the book that I had been looking for before, when initially I had accidentally stumbled across these texts. So I did a search for that book, the one that I had originally looked for. I got the location, went back to the general area, and then I looked at the shelves around nearby until I found the book that I had wanted. So this is a good lesson. Some things aren't always easily found or accessible when you do database searches, and you really should take the time to look around you. On a related note, when you're conducting research, you may get a hold of an article or book that you thought was going to be helpful, but it's clear from the first page or so it doesn't actually relate directly to your topic. Do not just put it down and forget about it. Before you set aside an article or book and you decide that it's really not going to be helpful for your research project, you really should spend a few minutes perusing the notes and the works cited section. Very often when you do this, you might find a reference to another article or book or a point being made that does relate to what you're working on. In fact, in several instances, I have found the notes and the bibliography of a book or an article to be more helpful than the content of that article itself. Okay, so now that we've covered some basics of research, let's go back to our specific example of the research paper on Arthurian literature. And again, the techniques I'm discussing here are easily translated to research for other kinds of writing. It's not just for the scholarly essay. but by using this one specific example, I hope you can see how this approach can work in practice. So let's examine some possible topics for this paper. How about the figure of King Arthur in literature? Okay, obviously, this is way too broad for a paper like this. You could write a book or 5 or 12 on this topic alone. So we've got to narrow that. So let's try again. How about the figure of King Arthur in medieval literature? Okay, that's more specific, but once you start researching, you'll probably, again, realize that this could fill an entire book or more. So we need to get a little more specific. What if we went with the characterization of King Arthur in Sir Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur? This is closer to what we're looking for. It focuses on just one text and just one character. But Malory's text is over 700 pages long in paperback, so this topic is probably still too big for, say, a college-level research paper. If we were dealing with a shorter text, something like the medieval text Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, then an analysis of the character of King Arthur in just that one text might work. But in this case, it doesn't. Now, it's possible that you can go too far toward the opposite end of the spectrum, and you can have topics that are far too narrow. For example, you could think, all right, I'll focus in on a key scene, and I'll do a topic like the importance of the moment when Arthur pulls the sword from the stone in Malory's text. This is possibly workable, but you may run out of things to say well before the end. A more satisfactory topic might be something like the significance of the shift in Arthur's character once he's founded the Order of the Round Table. This topic has as its main focus a particular moment in Malory's text, but then it also leaves you free to discuss moments both before and after it. In other words, it's focused, but it can be expanded. It's flexible while still having a great deal of specificity, and you can adequately address it in sort of the length that you might expect a college-level research paper to be. Now, at the beginning of this lecture, I talked about the importance of having some kind of research schedule, of setting yourself some deadlines to help motivate you as you move through the process of writing. So how long do you think you should give yourself to work on a project like this? Well, first of all, as you can imagine, everyone works at a different pace. Some people read quickly, some people have great retention when they read, others need to go back and reread some things a few times to really get the gist of what's important or key in terms of your topic or goal. But for an assignment like this, I would estimate that most people, depending on how many hours per day they can devote to it and how familiar they are with the topic to start with, I am estimating that this paper could get done in about 2 weeks. 1 week to do research, take notes, start to brainstorm the structure of the paper, and then maybe another week to take everything you've read and make use of it in your argument. Now, to be sure, these two activities, researching and writing, are necessarily going to overlap, but it's important to have an idea of how long the one and the other will generally last. At a certain point when you're still researching, you may get a really clear idea of how you want to open your essay or short story or magazine article. Now, should you not start writing just because you're not into your writing week yet? Of course not. If you feel inspired to write, you should start, while keeping in mind that you may change what you've written, or you might throw it out altogether once you've done a little more research. Or you may come across a quote that you want to use as one of your supporting points that would occur midway through the paper. By all means, go ahead, write it down, and do some drafting of the way you're going to use this point in your argument. By the same token, at a certain point, you may have to make yourself stop reading and start writing. When you're researching, you may feel that you just can't write yet. There's so much more you could read. And it's important to remember that that's always going to be true. There is always something else you can read. There's always more research you can do. But at some point, you're going to have to put down the book and you're going to have to put the pen to the paper or your fingers to the keyboard, as the case may be. And when you start writing in earnest, you're going to need to be able to have all that research you spent so much time collecting easily accessible so that you can use all that stuff that you looked up online, that you tracked down at the library, that you found through perusing footnotes and you read and reread and reread. In our next lecture, we'll talk about putting all your research efforts to work as you start the process of writing.